You can't replace part of the brain. Like, you
treat them the same.
A source of truth for the medtech industry.
Coexists with the province.
Robot understands things automatically.
Number one show in the medtech industry.
So Stryker got ahead of that and changed in the 90s, built $1 billion company that held up high, a lot of things.
State of MedTech.
With your host, Omar and Khatib.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the show and Happy New Year. So to kick things off, we have a really interesting device, specifically in the interventional neurology space. As we know, mainly from the BCI space, there's a lot of excitement around innovation when it comes to the neuroscience space. I think Elon Musk and Neuralink really popularized that, but there's a lot of fantastic companies also coming out in the same space. One of those is Vonova, and we have their founder, Dr. Jose Morales, with us today. Dr. Morales, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Great. Thank you, Omar. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. And, thank you for your duty because, you even through Christmas, you're on call now, but we appreciate you carving out some time to come on the show today.
Oh, I really appreciate the opportunity. Hopefully we can get through this interview without any interruptions.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, you're on call over there, and then I have a 2.5-year-old. So let's hope for the best. So maybe before we get started and jump into the technology, could you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself? Like where did you go to medical school? Where did you do your training? And, I think this is your first, is this your first medtech company that you founded?
Yes. So I guess long story short, I'm what we call a non-traditional student who went to school at first with a liberal studies degree, worked in business for a few years, and decided I want to make a pivot into healthcare. And a lot of that was driven by seeing the signs of the Moore's Law application, as it evolved in computers and technology and software, and seeing that the writing was on the wall for medtech and, sort of healthcare technologies to do the same. And so I really thought there was a great opportunity to be a part of an innovation wave that was going to transform patient care. And that's what got me interested. So I went back to school at the University of Central Florida, and I did a second degree in molecular biology and got really interested in neuroscience. I was participating in a neural stem cell research lab and ended up applying and got into under a scholarship at Imperial College London. And I studied integrative neuroscience there and got exposed to cognitive networks, neural networks, fMRI data in humans, and really got fascinated by the brain through that experience. After that, I went to Harvard Medical School as a research assistant and got a lens into that world. A lot of hardworking people, very smart, but very hardworking, and trying to make, a big impact in their fields. And it really inspired me to continue to sort of thrive for just more than, good enough. So I wasn't interested in just sort of being a doctor and kind of sitting back on my laurels. I wanted to sort of push the envelope a little bit. And so that opportunity kind of gave me a little bit more insight into some of the highest level of operation when it comes to research and ambition. And from there, I went to medical school at the University of Chicago, and I took a year off in an extended curriculum option to do brain-computer interface research with Dr. Nicholas Sisopoulos, who was the founder of BrainGate. And I think his father was one of the founders of, what's it, Fisher Scientific or something like that.
Oh, Thermo Fisher?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a hell of a bloodline there, for at least in terms of medtech royalty.
Yeah, but he was just he was one of the earliest investigators in brain computer interface, and really taught me a lot about that space. There's not a lot that we understand about how the brain actually encodes information, and so when we quote unquote reverse engineer this, we're actually just sort of doing some sort of algorithm that can interpret changes and just assign a function to that change. And as long as it's repetitive, and in a way, the brain just sort of adapts its signals based on goal-oriented behavior to kind of give you the repetitive results. So in a way, not very naturalistic. So there's no real understanding of how neurons at an individual basis or level actually are encoding this information. And so we just use very, very, rudimentary methods
Wesley Jones.
of trying to better understand that.
Amazing. I love that your phone went off, so it feels. I feel like we're hanging out in the call room with you. Yeah, that's amazing. It's interesting. When you look at physiology and see how like neurons work and synapses, but then you try and extrapolate from that and say, look, well, how does like thought occur? And how does the subconscious work? So it's really exciting these days. You mentioned Moore's law. I feel like Moore's law is like on steroids these days with the last few years in terms of LLMs and AI and everything. And I think we're just at the start. I don't know. I felt like the singularity was happening like maybe from 10 years ago when we started using smartphones. But I feel like we're definitely there now because, with ChatGPT and Perplexity and, people, children like my son at some point are going to grow up and these are going to be just like extensions of like human experience, So it's a really exciting time to be alive.
Absolutely. And I think, more than anything, right, this whole era, I think historically people thought automation and innovation were going to replace sort of the grunts of the workforce. I think now there's a real concern that it's going to replace a lot of the white collar workers, right? But in a way, I think it puts more emphasis on the creators and creatives.
Absolutely.
People who actually can be thought leaders and really point things in a different direction, as opposed to people who are just going to continue status quo, which can probably be done by computers in the near future.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Even Mark Benioff of Salesforce, he was on, I think, Harry Stebbings' 20 VC podcast, and he was mentioning that they're not hiring any more developers or programmers in 2025. None. They got like a 20 to 30% lift just using AI agents. And so, I mean, computer programming, and I think you remember the time where it was like, oh, learn how to code and everything was there was a big push. And I always thought like, yeah, computer programmers and stuff, like, it's a highly in demand job. Not a lot of them. You should be fine. But like, yeah, it's really, really interesting times. So being, so after you finished over at U Chicago, where did you train? And then you're now here out in the West Coast, correct?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's kind of important to highlight that in 2015, while I was a medical student, was when the trials for mechanical thrombectomy were first published and announced as positive. So there was a few trials before then that had failed to show a clinical benefit over this mechanical opening of a vessel with a stroke that's occluding blood flow to the brain. And a lot of it was just poor trial design, poor inclusion criteria. And so the founding members of that field really sort of refined the inclusion criteria in the clinical trial and had a resoundingly positive trial that actually got halted because it was so vastly superior to medical management alone. And so that was something that I had a big interest in, thinking about cardiology and cardiology's evolution from being plumbers of the heart to actually treating structural heart disease, including atrial mapping and ablation and valve replacement, PFO closures. I thought that that's where neuro had to be headed, but I felt a little bit apprehensive about leaving that whole background of computational neuroscience, neurophysiology, cognitive networks, in pursuit of a field that was totally unrelated to any of those neuroscience topics. And so I remember I was Googling when I was trying to make my match list about what I was going to do with my fourth year of medical school, or my last year of medical school. I was like Googling, like, has anybody thought about putting a stent with electrodes? And I just like Googled it, and this Nature paper came up by Tom Oxley. And I was just like, this is coming together. So, this is where you're going to have this endovascular access sort of be the, the platform for neural device implantation in a way that we just don't really have in current state of medicine. So I that really helped shift my, my focus and really got me enthusiastic about being a part of this field that was rapidly evolving and had opportunities, I think, for people who wanted to take a risk and were creatives, to go ahead and throw their hat in the ring and try to do something completely different.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's pretty inspiring too, because like that must have been a really difficult decision. Do you remember the back to the day, like when you read that paper, like was that really the moment that you decided to pursue this new path?
It was a combination of those trials, and yeah, that new path. And I'd actually been really interested in functional neurosurgery for a bit before that. So I'd done some reticular neurosurgery.
So that's definitely a very it's a very new and very interesting field. But for the listeners, I think even those who are in the neurosurgery field, functional neurosurgery is very new. Can you explain to the audience what functional neurosurgery is?
All right, everyone, quick commercial break. If you're a medtech CEO/founder, or maybe you're a sales or marketing leader at a startup or a scale up, you're going to want to listen to this. Are you struggling to get in front of your ideal audience, whether that's investors or perhaps clinicians who want to adopt your product? Maybe you're getting ghosted. You send emails and messages and nothing comes back, nothing happens, right? Or worse, nobody knows who you are, right? In business, visibility is everything. And I always tell people, if you want to persuade before persuasion can happen, you have to learn how to get attention. So if your sales team is desperate for traction, clinicians don't know your name, investors have never heard of you, you're losing opportunities every day. And that needs to change now. Not tomorrow, not next week, now. That's where my company, Catheter & Co. comes in. We don't just do marketing, we do growth. We figure out how to engineer markets by creating magnetic messaging that makes you impossible to ignore. And we build high impact strategies, of course, using social media, but other channels such as email, text, and others to help turn content and messaging into commercial pipeline, and it leads into closed deals. As an example, we worked with a surgical robotics company in raising a $31 million Series A, and then they needed help on their pre-market release. So we packed their CRM with 198 surgeon leads and nurtured them down. That ended up becoming 4 closed hospitals. 4 hospitals closed and adopted this technology within a period of 6 months, and they got 2 great key opinion leaders in the process. So whether you're a startup founder wearing too many hats, or maybe you have a marketing team that just spread too thin and they don't have the expertise, my team and I plug in and partner up with your company, and we amplify your reach. From crafting powerful sales scripts to optimizing your team's demo calls, creating content, having it go out on a consistent basis, we transform your outreach into a growth engine. So if you're ready to dominate your market, you're ready to become a no name and people to know of you and take your calls and take your meetings, I want you to act right now. Don't wait anymore, because you've already wasted plenty of time. Go to growmymedtech.com. That's growmymedtech.com. And I want you to schedule a quick call. My team and I will give you a free analysis with 2 to 3 actionable ideas. There's no strings attached. And if we're a fit, great. We can get partnered up and we can help you go to the next level. And if not, look, the ideas are always free. So do not wait and don't waste any more time. Go to growmymedtech.com right now, and let's make you the go-to name in your niche. Now, let's get back to the episode.
Yeah, so functional neurosurgery is a field right now that's involved with deep brain stimulator placements. They do epilepsy surgeries. It depends, on the hospital and the clinical practice setting and culture, but in general, right, it's just an application of like bioelectronic devices for neurologic problems. And I would say that, it really got its start in spinal cord stimulation and then in deep brain stimulation for movement disorders. And, that field has kind of expanded to include epilepsy, which has devices like NeuroPace, which is almost like a pacemaker that you implants right in a skull window, and it helps sort of shock the brain when a seizure is about to develop, and it can halt those seizures. And so that was kind of, I think, more in line with the interests of the research that I had done and what I had dedicated a lot of my time to outside of learning medicine. And so I thought that was a more natural fit. But it was just, I remember having a conversation, and my mentor at the time, Peter Warnke, he was a functional neurosurgeon at U Chicago. And he was just like, at the end of the day, it's all going to be interventional neurology. And when he said that, it kind of like resounded with me a little bit, and it started thinking about neurointerventional surgery and how that field might evolve to take some of these applications out from like an invasive approach.
Interesting. So tell us a little about Vonova. Like, how did you conceive the idea of Vonova, and what's the big problem that Vonova solves?
Yeah, so Vonova is the first minimally invasive platform that allows you to access the brain without having to drill through the skull or remove pieces of the skull. That's something that, these approaches with functional neurosurgery, they quote unquote are minimally invasive, but they still rely on a technique that was first developed in the Stone Ages, believe it or not. It's called trepanation. And trepanation was used historically also for diseases like subdural hematoma, where the blood collects underneath the covering of the brain called the dura. And it creates a mass effect, and it can cause a lot of neurologic dysfunction, cause seizures. And so you could imagine back in the Stone Age, somebody having a seizure or having some dysfunction that they thought like a demon had possessed them. And so they would drill a hole in the skull, and this old blood, which is just hemolyzed blood, looks black, looks like motor oil, would just ooze out. And they were like, we're getting rid of all the evil spirits. And so I think that, we have to do better. There has to be a way to do this that doesn't require burr holes and removing the skull. Because at the end of the day, I think we all have pretty strong desire to keep our structural integrity in place. I don't think anybody likes the idea of anything invasive occurring to them. And in reality, surgery has risk, and some of those risks include infection, brain injury, and it's never a perfect science. And I think the more that we can kind of get into techniques that use instruments that may eventually or be more amenable to sort of robotic platforms, the more we can get towards a standard state of quality and expanding access to care.
Interesting. And when you talk about it's trepidation, correct?
Trepanation, it's like making a hole in the skull.
Yeah. So when you burr a hole for neurosurgery, or in many cases, you have to remove like a quarter inch flap. Aside from the obvious, which is like infection, like what are some other problems with trepidation that patients get exposed to?
Well, so in reality, I think it's relatively a safe procedure. So I wouldn't say that it's like a huge problem per se. But I could tell you from my clinical practice, for instance, with subdural hematoma, I'll have patients who undergo burr hole drainage of that subdural hematoma, but then there's all these randomized clinical trials showing that there's a benefit to doing middle meningeal artery embolization, which reduces the recurrence of subdurals, which is the biggest issue with them. So you eliminate them from this drain, and then they just sort of come back. And so this was first discovered by this guy in Japan, and he developed it in the clinical case series over the next 20, 30 years, sort of developed this groundswell of evidence that resulted in these clinical trials. And so right now what you have is a little bit of a disjointed workflow. So I just, did a case recently where the surgery occurred the day before, and then they wanted to get this middle meningeal artery embolization because they were concerned about recurrence. And, I had to coordinate for this next procedure within the same hospitalization the next day. And so not only that, but usually with the burr hole, because you're open to atmosphere, meaning to open air, you have to go kind of do like a slow passive drainage because you can overdrain, and that can cause the brain to shift. So using a closed system can kind of mitigate that. It can accelerate the drainage without necessarily exposing patients to that risk of brain shift. And so I think that there's those advantages of being able to do things within a consolidated workflow, as well as not exposing patients to this prolonged drainage, which is usually 24 to 48 hours, with a risk of infection and a risk of neurologic injury when you're inserting this drain catheter, and just do it all with a minimally invasive approach that doesn't require any of these invasive measures.
Got it. Well, and you shared a video of the device. So I'm going to pull that up. If you can kind of give us like a little play-by-play. Let me pull this up for those who are watching on Spotify and YouTube. You can see this. If not, sorry, you're going to have to go to YouTube or Spotify to watch this. Here we go. Perfect. All right. Let's see.
Yeah, so there's this subdural hematoma on the left-hand side of the screen.
Right here. And what are some common ways that somebody can get a subdural hematoma? The one that I'm most familiar with is like head trauma.
Correct. Head trauma is probably one of the most common. ways of getting one, but you also can get them as you age because of brain shrinkage. So when your brain shrinks, it creates a bit of a potential space, and that potential space ends up kind of creating a vacuum in a way that whenever you have a leak of a vein, as the veins are stretched as your brain shrinks, they can kind of tear and it can kind of spontaneously bleed into that space. And you've got this big potential space that's just willing to accept it.
And I would assume that's probably one of the reasons why one of the most common causes of death for people above the age of 65 is falling. And I would imagine that's part of that is like that. Yeah, that brain shrinkage. So you have a higher chance of a hematoma. If it's big enough, it could kill you. Is that would that be a correct way to look at that?
Yeah. So there's a higher incidence because of an aging population, and that's becoming more and more true as we get into these advanced state of society and medicine. People are living longer, and the physiology is still the same. So your genetics are programming you to, sort of shrink in age, and that causes the brain to shrink. People are more likely to be on blood thinner now than they've ever been before because the state or the incidence of chronic disease is going up. And all these things predispose to having these subdural hematomas, and like you said, falls. And it is a sign of frailty. So there's a greater risk of mortality among patients who have subdural hematomas. And it's sort of like hip fractures.
Got it.
It's not the hip fracture itself that kills a person, but it's just a sign that there's, some frailty built up. Same thing with subdural hematomas. They rarely cause death in and of itself, but they're sort of like this insidious disease that kind of comes on, causes neurologic deficits and predisposes to this increased risk of death within a year.
Got it. Okay. Let's keep going here.
So we use our Access platform as what we say catheters, which are long, thin tubes that are flexible and enable us to kind of track these within the vessels of the brain. This is our Access catheter with our instrumentation that's used to kind of track into the superior sagittal sinus.
And what vessel do you use as your point of access on the patient to start getting there?
Yeah, so we use the jugular vein.
Okay, got it. Okay.
So the jugular vein, just a little small needle poke. We thread this catheter up over a wire. This is a superior sagittal sinus, which is the largest vein within the brain. And unlike arteries, they don't taper as much when you go up into the skull. And so we're able to use a wire to puncture across the dura, and a set of coaxial devices, which essentially spread those fibers and give you more space to put in an aspiration catheter, which can land right into the subdural hematoma, which is generally seeing a full laterality of the head. And so we're able to suck that out pretty effectively and do so without ever opening up the skull or leaving a drain in place, and giving patients immediate relief from compressive effects of having a big blood collection sitting on their brain.
Got it. What's this sort of orb looking thing? Is this just to sit on the outside of the skull, or what is that?
No, so that's a balloon. So that balloon,
Like a balloon catheter?
Yep. So that when you're in the superior sagittal sinus, it's kind of a large caliber vessel. So you need a balloon to kind of offset your puncture site, so that you can kind of, once you get up into the superior sagittal sinus, if you want to fast forward a little bit, when we do that puncture there, you can see that the catheter needs to move to one side of the wall.
Oh, I see. So you use that to essentially take up space and press the catheter to one side or another.
Exactly.
How do you decide, what are you using for visualization?
So it's all under X-ray guidance.
Okay.
So these catheters and devices all have pick markers, so it enables us to see them under X-ray. And the balloon itself is filled with contrast media, so that also enables you to see it under X-ray and orient it.
I see. And then on the suction side, is this a manual suction, or what? Is there? How do you guys enable suction?
Yeah. So right now we've been using. We've done a few things. We've done an application that's sort of like an automatic aspiration device, and then we've also done things manually. Should be noted that like manual aspiration is actually the largest force that you can create, and it's the least controlled force. So I think on the horizon or in the future is the idea is that what we can do is potentially create a capital piece of equipment that's going to give you real-time information about what your aspiration force is, as well as what the pressure inside the brain is, which is something that's not part of the workflow right now for subdural hematomas. So really making it like a smarter procedure that's not just totally agnostic to what's going on inside the brain.
And the current workflow for the procedure is essentially going and doing trepidation to get the hematoma out. And so that's done by neurosurgeons. So essentially all hematomas are, is it safe to say the majority of hematomas are essentially treated by neurosurgeons now through trepidation?
Yeah, through burr hole access. Yeah, so trepidation is kind of like an old term, but yeah, burr hole access is probably the standard for chronic subdural hematoma. For acute subdural hematoma, it's usually craniotomy. And but I think important to note is that neurointerventionalists like myself are currently being involved in the workflow because of these recent trial results that suggest that if we block the artery that covers the covering of the artery that supplies the covering of the brain called the dura, then we can decrease the recurrence rate, which has actually been the bane of neurosurgeons, that they would put drains in and drain these, and the patient would come back like a month later with recurrence and a reaccumulation of this blood. And so being able to minimize that recurrence down to like less than 4% or about 4% is something that our procedure enables us to do. And in a way, it's also being investigated as a way of treating severe hematomas as a standalone treatment when they're not overly symptomatic from the compressive effects of the blood collection. And so we also done that as part of our workflow. So in a way, I think that our involvement within this disease space is creating already a minimally invasive option, but it's still somewhat disjointed and clumsy. And so I think creating an integrated workflow or a comprehensive solution with one practitioner or one subspecialty, I think is really going to open up doors for patients without sort of like, gaps in medical knowledge. I think if you were to poll most doctors in the hospital, they wouldn't even know what middle meningeal artery embolization is. But we do know that based on the trial results, that's going to be the standard of care soon enough.
Yeah, and I think the thing that stands out to me here is the improvement in patient access. So right now you mentioned it being done through neurosurgeons, and again, I don't know how accurate these numbers are, but Googling the number of neurosurgeons in the United States today, it's roughly around like 3,500, and then when we check the number of neurologists, it's almost 3 times more, at somewhere around like 95 to 10,000. And so is that the thought here, is that by using this kind of device and this new technique, you improve access for treating subdural hematomas?
Well, let's be clear. So neurointerventional surgeons are kind of like a subspecialty, and that subspecialty actually is fed into by 3 different subspecialties. So you could be a radiologist that undergoes training in diagnostic neuroradiology and then does neurointerventional surgery as a subspecialty. You could be a neurosurgeon who ends up doing neuroendovascular surgery as a subspecialty, or you could be a neurologist who goes through critical care or vascular neurology to end up doing neurointerventional surgery. So we all sort of end up at the same pathway, but that workforce is currently estimated to be somewhere between 25 to 3,500 as well. And that the societal push for this subspecialty is treatment for stroke. One of the first things that we noticed when we had this really effective treatment, so like the stroke treatment for mechanical thrombectomy, you only need to treat like 2 to 3 patients to get a good outcome. And that's like really unheard of in medicine. That's a really, really powerful intervention. And so that puts the onus on the government to kind of create this access. And so there's been a lot of initiatives to support hospitals in developing this service. So in a way, when you're saying expanding access, that's where I think that there's really an opportunity here, because there has been a lot of hospitals interested in hiring my subspecialty to be able to treat ruptured aneurysms and acute strokes. But, as we are now venturing into treating structural brain disease or disease that's extravascular, I think that we could really fill a gap there, because these patients generally are pretty sick. They're usually old and they're usually on blood thinners. And so that creates a lot of problems for the neurosurgeons. And so being able to do these things in a minimally invasive way, and in a field that's rapidly expanding to meet the demand for stroke, I think there's a real opportunity here to expand access to patients and communities that are generally underserved.
That's fantastic. And uh, right now for the company, where are you guys in your regulatory pathway? How much have you guys raised roughly? Um, give us a little, for the investors who are listening, give us a little insight on that.
Yeah, so we kind of keep what we've raised so far a little bit confidential. We're currently doing a seed raise.
Okay, so you guys are you're considered a pretty early stage company then. Okay.
Correct. We've got a workflow to get into first in human by next year, outside US. So we're raising essentially to meet that goal, to finish our prototyping and get done with our first in human. Yeah, what was the other question?
No, the other question is like, I get you kind of answered both, which is like, how much have you guys raised roughly, and then like where are you in your regulatory pathway? So you're essentially raising money to do your first in human next year.
Yeah, we've had discussions with the FDA. Um, we're shooting, and we think we have a good argument for a class 2 de novo. There's pros and cons to that, as you might know. So as a medical device company, you can kind of create a moat around yourself if you do class 3 PMA, but it really scares a lot of investors away because of the timeline. It's ultimately not going to be decided until the FDA reviews some of the early data. And so they have to kind of meet as a committee and make a determination whether or not they think it's low risk enough to be class 2 de novo, or they think it's higher risk and requires a full sort of PMA. That's sort of the thinking right now. I think we have a good argument for either one. In terms of clinical, we have a strategy to kind of minimize sample size by comparing it to the current standard of care, and then just showing a radiographic difference. So I think that despite it being a really innovative new way of getting access to the brain, I think that we've got a really good strategy to kind of minimize the risk in terms of development and timeline to get to patients and eventually through FDA. And that's just because honestly, we've gone through a lot of permutations of this. We've met with so many people. You'd be surprised. And I think it's something it's good for the audience to listen to, especially early stage entrepreneurs and startup founders, is that if you're really doing something new, nobody actually really knows what to tell you. And so a lot of people will have opinions. A lot of people will give you guidance, and sometimes their experience biases the advice that they give you. And so when we were originally pursuing a neural interface application, and we still are, but it's downstream. We had heard from somebody, just submit your, breakthrough designation papers. Like it's just, it's a Q-sub version, right? That you can do this. And we did. And then we just got a bunch of like, what are you doing? Like, we need human data. We need all this other stuff. And I was like, oh, interesting. And then when we spoke to the FDA more formally about this Subdural application, they're like, oh yeah, we'll definitely would want some data before doing this. And, I wouldn't suggest you just submit a Q-sub, but this was something that someone had advised us. They said, all you need is build the materials. That's their experience. Their experience in the devices that they've worked with have been, you can submit a Q-sub for de novo designation or breakthrough designation just based on the bill of materials. And so I was really perplexed by that, because you see companies like Paradromics and others that were getting this breakthrough designation despite not having human data. So I was really, really perplexed by that. And then I came to learn that the FDA, that branch that deals with neuromodulatory devices, has a very different approach to this than the ones that deal with neurovascular devices. And so one of them being much more conservative and the other one being a lot more liberal. And I won't specify which, but, I think that that's just like an important nugget that I think anybody will get when they start going into medical devices, unless you're doing something that's not to be too critical of it, but like a Me Too device or just like an incremental improvement, then it's probably pretty well defined which regulatory path you're going to end up in. But when you're doing something that has some novelty to it that doesn't have an exact predicate, you're going to run into a lot of people who are confident and wrong.
Right. Yeah. And I'm happy you pointed that out, especially for the founders listening. I'm wondering, when you look at neurointerventional procedures, let's say like when you're treating stroke, those do involve catheters. What will be the difference between that, which, you have access, you use a catheter to get access to the brain versus like what Vonova has?
Yeah, so our catheter platform's doing something unique. We're actually puncturing across a vessel wall, which is something that you don't do with catheters in the brain.
Oh, versus what I just described with strokes, you're not puncturing through a vessel wall. You're essentially going and, putting like a coil or something in like an aneurysm.
Within the vessel, exactly.
I see.
So the only applications that puncture across the vessel wall are in body IR and in, I guess body IR. So you've got transvenous biopsies, you've got transrenal biopsies, you have this TIPS procedure for people with portal hypertension. That's a transjugular puncture. So there are devices out there, like there's full frog Mercator catheter that does drug infusion across the vessel wall. It's like a little needle construct. And then you also have these like chronic total occlusion catheters in peripheral vascular space that do like a puncture and get you access around the clot within a different plane of the vessel. So there are certainly applications that exist that are transvascular or puncturing through the vessel wall, but they don't exist for the brain. The only company doing something similar to what we're doing, and I would argue in a less versatile manner, is Ceravas, but they're e-shunts. And so they go off the first vein that branches off the internal jugular. So relatively straight shot, doesn't require a very flexible device. And in a very circumscribed anatomical space, they puncture across into this fluid-filled pocket to drain the fluid that builds up in the brain in people who have hydrocephalus.
Got it. In terms of, so when we look at the device itself, it sounds like a lot of the IP is essentially built around the balloon that essentially presses the catheter against the vessel wall. So that way you have, you're able to make that puncture and access, and then the ability to puncture and access. What does your IP look like right now, like roughly? I mean, without giving too many details, but again, mainly for the investors who are listening, because especially when you have like a de novo device or something so new, the first thing they want to know is like, okay, what's the IP look like?
Yeah, so I mean, we're very lucky that way. We've got 4 issued patents, so they've already been reviewed and granted. We have
Congratulations.
Thank you. So when I say 4 issued, those are the methods and apparatus, and we were really concerned about the apparatus for, just the access platform, because those are pretty hard to get. And I think we're really proud of being able to achieve that. And then we have a few patents in continuation, right, that expand on the applications, that expand on some improvements that we've learned along the way. And I think we're feeling really confident that we predate a lot of the people in the space who are now taking an interest. So I think this field is at a key inflection point, and there's a lot of people trying to develop applications around this now that others like Ceravas and ourselves are kind of getting a little bit more airplay. It's making people curious and trying to patent around the spot to try and develop their own application.
Got it. And then, just again, I'm thinking about the investors in the audience who might be new to the space. But in the event that, you guys do your first in human, everything goes well, you start commercializing, let's not use the word acquisition. Let's say like partnerships, but like, what are some of the strategies that kind of come to mind who might get more interested in Vonova and also like what you guys are doing? I like, for me, maybe, I don't know the space too well, but like Penumbra comes to mind. Maybe I don't know about Inari, probably not Inari, but Penumbra is one, Imperative Care is another one. But what are some of the strategies that kind of come to mind in terms of who's in this space, and might, have an interest to like lead around, invest, etc.?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's a great question. And I think that's where we have a really good advantage, that especially now that they've done all these clinical trials on subdural hematoma with this middle meningeal artery embolization, that only prevents the recurrence, right? But isn't dealing with the upfront symptomatic aspect of it. So as a company that's a neurovascular application or endovascular tool that can synergize with their existing portfolio, where all these strategics have already put their money into, because they realize this is going to be the next biggest market in neurovascular. So right now, I would say, like, in terms of sheer numbers, stroke thrombectomy is probably the most that we're doing. And then followed by aneurysms. Right now, the estimate is that subdural hematoma is going to be an even larger market. So just to give you an instance of that, J&J funded their own trial for MMA embolization in the subdural space. And then Medtronic funded its own trial. And you have other players that have these materials that are used to block this middle meningeal artery, like Bolt and Microvention. They're all interested as well in jumping into this subdural hematoma space. It's just volume speaks, right? And so having the next largest volume application, something that you can use for that, I think is going to be really important. So in addition to that, having IP and an interest in developing this neural interface, I think has a lot of great synergies with the companies that have diverse portfolios, like a Boston Scientific or a Medtronic or even a Stryker. So I think that those companies in particular, right, we're talking about Terumo, Medtronic, Stryker, J&J, all of these players are heavily invested in the neurovascular space. They all see this as a potential next stage and the evolution of these devices that's getting away from more invasive, historical, archaic means of getting access to the brain.
Awesome. Yeah, it's really exciting too. I know that you guys are again early stage, so I doubt you'll be exhibiting. But for the year, whether it's an investor or clinician, are there any conferences you guys are going to be attending?
Yeah, so I think Wesley just did LSI last year. I'm actually going to be doing this Arise conference, which is basically a small conference by invitation only, coordinated in the neurovascular field by AJ Wacklu. And it basically brings together key stakeholders in government, so CMS, NIH, FDA, with key opinion leaders in the neurovascular space and emerging startups and other industry members that are interested in kind of creating this crosstalk between the three vested stakeholders to kind of usher in this new innovation, new frontiers, new indications, and try to create a pathway, right, that's sensical and that brings all these stakeholders together so that they're not speaking in silos. So I am speaking at that conference in the summer. There's I'm blanking on the name of it. There's a brain conference in London. I've been asked several years in a row to come speak there, and I've been kind of holding off. And I think this next coming year is going to be the year where we go. Yeah, I mean, so the two that come to mind, and I think Wes is going to be at JP Morgan in January, so that's another opportunity there. And they kind of come up here and there, so we just sort of take those opportunities as they come.
Fantastic. Yeah. In the meantime, for clinicians and investors who are listening, you can check out their website at Vonova.io, Vonova.io. You always know a company that's serious about tech when they pay the extra money and get the .io. So.
Oh, really? I didn't know. I thought that this was just like it ran out of .coms.
Oh no, in the domain world, when you the .io is more valuable real estate now.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah. You can take the most benign thing in the world and put .io after it, and people are like, oh, it's like that's tech, it's high tech, And
I forgot to mention that I'll also be at Octane this year.
Oh, nice. I've heard a lot of good things about Octane. I think I it's local to me, so I got to go check it out,
Yeah.
So, well, fantastic. Well, look, Dr. Morales, we really appreciate you coming on the show, especially considering how early stage it is, but we love getting, great companies on early. So that way, you can come back maybe within a year, report back on the results of the first in human and everything. We wish you the best of luck. For those who are listening, again, go check them out at Vonova.io. I know that Dr. Morales and Wesley are both on LinkedIn, so connect with them. You'll see some updates from the company. And for the meantime, if you like this episode, somebody who's interested in the neuro space, go ahead and forward this on to them. Be sure to like and subscribe and give us those 5 stars and a review. I'm your host, Omar Khatib, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks for checking out this episode. If you want to do me a big favor and join so many other people who have helped grow this podcast, take a second and look below. If you're on Apple, give us 5 stars and write a short review. If you're on Spotify, just give us 5 stars. And if you're on YouTube, hit the like button. And most importantly, if you can, subscribe. We release so many different episodes that you may miss. Be sure to subscribe and turn your notifications on. You get extra points with me if you subscribe across all 3 channels. Thank you so much. And if you felt like this episode helped you, send this to somebody who'd really enjoy and appreciate it. Share and spread the love. We'll see you all next time.